is Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C.
I'm Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Tonight, a special edition of Balance of Power, the U.S. military strike on Iran and the threat of a widening war in the Middle East.
The president authorized a precision operation to neutralize the threats to our national interests posed by the Iranian nuclear program. This mission was not and has not been about regime change.
History will record that President Trump acted to deny the world's most dangerous regime the world's most dangerous weapons.
Tonight I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success.
The world awaiting a response from Tehran after U.S. aircraft penetrated Iranian airspace using bunker-busting bombs to strike the heart of the regime's nuclear sites.
The details behind the Pentagon's 37-hour Operation Midnight Hammer, the aftermath, and how the American military is now preparing for retaliation when former National Security Advisor John Bolton joins us.
Plus, U.S. equity and oil futures opening at this hour with stock futures sinking and crude up 4% on both Brent and WTI. We'll dive into the action we're seeing and what the current conflict means for U.S. assets.
Also, how Washington is reacting to that surprise attack. Congressional leaders informed moments after it was conducted. We'll speak with the vice chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee when Congressman Darrell Issa joins us.
All of that and more on this special edition of Balance of Power, the attack on Iran.
Iran, the bully of the Middle East, must now make peace. If they do not, future attacks will be far greater and a lot easier.
Tonight, new details on the surprise multi-pronged strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. The President of the United States announcing it to Americans less than 24 hours ago.
A short time ago, the U.S. military carried out massive precision strikes on the 3 key nuclear facilities in the Iranian regime: Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. Everybody heard those names for years as they built this horribly destructive enterprise.
Kendall at the White House now as the world waits for potential retaliation from Iran. The State Department is now urging increased caution to U.S. citizens abroad. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe, good evening. Well, a U.S. official tells us that President Trump has spent today working here at the White House. It is our understanding that he had a phone call with U.K. Prime Minister Keir Starmer a short time ago as the U.S. and its allies are calling for talks to resume over Iran's nuclear program, with President Trump threatening further action if Iran does not come to the negotiating table. But it's something that Iranian officials reiterated today cannot happen unless the strikes against them stop first. Now, it is interesting to note that U.S. officials really have maintained that the mission of this operation has been to destroy Iran's nuclear program and its ambitions. But then we got a post from President Trump on Truth Social within the last hour where he used the words regime change, reading in part, quote, "If the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be a regime change?" We should note it's unclear under what circumstances the U.S. would really support this. But looking ahead, we are going to have to consider that as a factor here as we watch how both sides are going to react. Another thing that we're waiting on is that U.S. officials, as well as the International Atomic Energy Agency, do tell us that it is going to take a long time to get that fuller assessment about how much damage actually did happen when it does come to these strikes. But we did hear from Vice President J.D. Vance earlier today in a series of interviews where he said that the U.S. maintains that it did significant damage when it comes to delaying Iran's ambitions for a nuclear weapon. But he did signal that Iran still holds on to a stockpile of enriched uranium.
Well, and of course, as we consider the capabilities Iran may still have at its disposal, Tyler, what risk does that put U.S. troops in the Middle East in now, and what is the White House doing to try to hedge against that risk?
Well, the White House has said that it has been proactive when it comes to protecting our troops. As you well know, we did move personnel out of Iraq last week as one example. But given the fact that there are more than 40,000 troops deployed in theater at the moment, that really does heighten the risk here when it comes to how the U.S. is viewing this picture holistically. We should say, though, that our analysts at Bloomberg do indicate that Iran might temper its response due to a few different factors here, including a weak economy, domestic discontent with the regime, and also the fact that we haven't really seen strategic allies of Iran lend anything more than rhetorical support at the moment, though, of course, we are watching it very closely. But Joe and Kailey, today, Iran's parliament did vote to close the Strait of Hormuz. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to happen, but that would be, of course, a significant development in this, and no doubt would be contributing to the moves that we're seeing when it comes to oil.
All right, Tyler, thank you. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live at the White House. We'll check back with Tyler a bit later on this hour. Today on NBC's Meet the Press, Vice President J.D. Vance, to Tyler's point, shared whether he believes President Trump wants regime change in Iran. Here's what he said.
It was not an attack on Iran. It was not an attack on the Iranian people. This wasn't a regime change move. This was designed to degrade and or destroy 3 nuclear sites related to their nuclear weaponization ambitions. There are no planned military operations right now against Iran unless they mess around and they attack American or American interests. Then they're going to have a problem.
Clearly, that was Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's also doubling now as the president's national security advisor. This morning, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth discussed the extent of the strikes against Iran's nuclear program. Listen. All right, why don't we move ahead here?
We devastated the Iranian nuclear program. But it's worth noting the operation did not target Iranian troops or the Iranian people. For the entirety of his time in office, President Trump has consistently stated for over 10 years that Iran must not get a nuclear weapon. Full stop. Thanks to President Trump's bold and visionary leadership and his commitment to peace through strength, Iran's nuclear ambitions have been obliterated.
All right, let's add the voice of John Bolton, the former U.S. ambassador to the UN and former national security advisor in the first Trump administration. Mr. Bolton, it's good to see you, and we thank you for being with us today on Bloomberg TV and radio. I don't know what you make of this rhetorical dance that we're hearing about the extent of damage, starting with President Trump suggesting that Fordo was obliterated. We've heard more tempered comments from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and other analysts who are looking at this, including the IAEA. Did we go far enough?
Well, I don't think the job is finished. I think it's very difficult to make evaluations of how effective we've been, for example, at Fordo, which by definition was under a mountain. And it's very difficult to see inside. But my guess is that what the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Kane, said is accurate, that there was severe damage. We'll be checking further and seeing what happened. There are a lot of other pieces, though, that need to be put into play here. We know, we've seen from overhead photographs that during the 60-plus days of negotiation that President Trump offered, the Iranians did a fair amount of work trying to move perhaps uranium stockpiles, perhaps sensitive machinery out of some of these key target areas. We may or may not know where that is, but I don't think this is over yet, just on the mission of destroying these 3 sites.
Well, and on that mission, administration officials have maintained today that the objective was solely to focus on Iran's nuclear capabilities, that this objective was not regime change. But, sir, even if it wasn't the objective, could that still be the end result, and how?
Well, exactly. And even as we just heard, the president has been tweeting about regime change. I mean, I think regime change has to be the objective because the Ayatollahs are never going to give up their pursuit of nuclear weapons. They have to be forced out of power. That's the only shot we have at really lasting peace and security in the Middle East. And a strike like this, and potentially others, and certainly Israel's ongoing attacks, can disrupt the regime, can destabilize it. Look at the choice that the top military officials and key Ayatollahs now have to face after the U.S. attack. They've been beaten badly by the Israelis ever since Hamas's attack out of Gaza on October the 7th, 2023. Now they have to make a choice. Do they want to take on a second military adversary in the form of the United States? They may well do it. Look, it's a regime run by medieval religious fanatics. They may well retaliate against the United States, but they would be making a big mistake from the point of view of regime survival.
Well, when we consider the day after, whether it's an attack on the Al-Assad air base, as we saw after the killing of Qasem Soleimani, maybe against Bahrain, the home of the Fifth Fleet. Maybe it's something we're not thinking of here. What would be the U.S. response? What should it be?
Well, I think there are three categories of possible targets. One, obviously, is more attacks on Israel. Second would be attacks against the Gulf Arab states, the oil-producing nations of the Gulf. And third, on the U.S., deployed military forces, our consulates, our embassies, private American citizens in the region, and terrorist attacks against Americans and others around the world, including in this country. Obviously, our first concern is the Americans, but we're going to do everything we can to defend Israel. And I think we should make it clear to the Gulf Arab states and Jordan and Egypt that we'll be defending them, too. We have a common interest against this Iranian threat. And it really, at this point, is much harder for Iran to do what they might like to do, given the pounding that they've been taking from Israel, given that their terrorist proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah, have been badly beaten. Their key ally, the Assad regime in Syria, has fallen. This is not the Iran it was on October the 6th, 2023. That's for sure.
Well, as we consider what capabilities Iran may have to retaliate militarily, what if it just is in the form of Iran no longer cooperating or participating in, say, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, no longer allowing IAEA inspectors to monitor what Iran is doing? Even if we may have diminished the threat of Iran's nuclear capability in the short term, does that not potentially risk, if they were to exit that agreement, much greater danger in the long term?
No, it wouldn't make any difference at all. They've been violating the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty for 25 or 30 years as it is now, because their commitment under that treaty was not to seek nuclear weapons in any form, and that's exactly what they've been doing. So withdrawal from the treaty is just meaningless. And as for the IAEA, look, it's been excluded from key sites, the weaponization activities and many others, for quite some time. IAEA is a good agency. I have a lot of respect for it, but it's not an intelligence agency. Frequently, the most important information that the IAEA deals with, we have given them.
Iran's parliament has voted to close the Strait of Hormuz, as you've heard. You may not take that seriously, John Bolton, but I wonder what our capability would be. If we see Iran begin to lay mines, could we stop that, or is there another way that they could close the strait?
Well, there are a number of ways they could try and do it, and that's why we've put substantially greater naval assets in the region, more on the way. This is something I think that may be more bluster than anything else. It can raise the level of danger, but we're fully aware that this has been a possibility. And if they try it, it won't simply be clearing mines away from the Strait of Hormuz that we do. I expect we would put much of the Iranian Navy on the bottom of the Red Sea. And we would be striking other targets inside Iran. This is a no-win proposition for them if they up the stakes that way.
All right, John Bolton, former U.S. ambassador to the UN and former national security advisor under the first Trump administration. Thank you. And as we consider the Strait of Hormuz, I would note that oil markets don't seem overly concerned by the prospect of that being choked off at this point. Both Brent and WTI futures up just over 3%. Brent crude right now trading at $79.50 a barrel. Now, we also have our eye on reaction from Capitol Hill, as there have been some questions over whether congressional approval should have been required for these strikes on Iran. Here's what several Democrats said earlier today.
What I think should have happened here, right up front, is him coming to Congress and asking for authorization to do this. That's the constitutional approach to this.
Congress needs to authorize a war against Iran, this Trump war against Iran. We have not. Congress should be consulted with it. We were not. And Congress needs to be notified, not after the fact, but in advance. We were not.
I'm, as a member of Congress, disturbed that this was undertaken without congressional approval. There's not much ambiguity in the Constitution about who gets to approve these things.
Joining us now with his reaction is Republican Congressman Darrell Issa of California, Vice Chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. Thanks for being here on Bloomberg TV and radio, Congressman.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Appreciate it.
And thanks for the lead-in. One after another of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle forgetting about everyone from Truman through Biden every one of them did a kinetic firing. None of them went to war. None of them came to Congress for the constitutional approval. And that's the only thing the Constitution says is going to war. The fact is, since Teddy Roosevelt famously said that you can, I'll send the Great White Fleet anywhere I want and you can pay to get them back, presidents have been very open about being the commander-in-chief and taking action, not in waiting for approval of Congress, not even necessarily consulting Congress, but informing Congress. And we were all very informed 60 days ago and a few days ago that this was likely to happen.
The entirety of the Gang of Eight was not read in before this strike happened.
Again, the traditions of whether or not you do something, whether that's a peril, I have to be honest. I've always had a concern that in something where so many of our brave men and women are going in harm's way, 125 aircraft, countless ships, any kind of a botch, and we'd end up with what Jimmy Carter ended up in the desert with, a disaster. The fact is this was pulled off perfectly, partially because of deception. Not a deception that it was going to likely happen, but a deception about exactly where and when. And I think the president did the right thing. And for those members who didn't say a word when President Clinton, through President Biden, Democrat after Democrat, launched against Libya, against Syria, the list is...
the matter of notification is something real, though, right? When Jim Himes says, the ranking member of the Intel Committee, he found out about it on social media.
I'm glad he's on social media.
Well, I guess he is. He found out about it when President Trump posted it like the rest of us. Is this the new normal for the sake of secrecy?
Look, I think it is a little bit of the new normal. When we got Osama bin Laden, we found out about it. You were probably in the audience when the president, was up there and they were taking him out. Look, there are things that are done with a recognition that they're likely to happen, but not the exact time and place and manner. But every part of this mission, the very successful mission the president did to once and for all make it clear we're not going to tolerate a nuclear Iran. And let's be honest, this is not about the 2 weeks that Bibi Netanyahu talks about all the time. When they passed 20% and went to 60% enrichment, they enriched uranium to a level that is useful for nothing but nuclear weapons. At that point, they were so far out of compliance with any claim that they weren't preparing to weaponize. And again, the president has made it clear he's holding out an olive branch every day, including today, but he's also made it clear he will not tolerate the continued behavior that has cost so many American lives all the way back to the early 1980s when the Iranian regime was young. They have been killing Americans.
I would note, Congressman, while we did hear from a number of Democrats, there is also one of your Republican colleagues, Thomas Massie, who has said that this was unconstitutional. He's pushing a war powers resolution he would like to see have a vote. If the olive branch does not work and the U.S. has to take continued military action, is that worth a vote? Should Congress get involved at that point?
I served with Ron Paul, the original Dr. No. I served on Judiciary and the full committee, the full Congress, with Thomas Massie. He's a wonderful libertarian with a wonderful interpretation. But just so you understand, the same Thomas Massie who absolutely says we have to do this in the Constitution would say that books, if they include statements about the law, can't be copyrighted. You can have a purist opinion, but history says that all the way back through Truman, before the War Powers Act, and since, president after president, to keep America safe, have acted without specific notice to Congress until after the fact.
If we, in fact, had a protracted conflict with Iran, though, I presume would sign off on a war powers agreement.
Absolutely. If we're going to put ground troops there, which I do not advise, look, Iraq was in a war with Iran for 8 years. There's 91 million people in Iran, most of whom are innocent victims of their own unelected regime. So when it's all said and done, we need to do for the Iranians what we can do, which is diminish the ability of that nation to export terrorism, encourage them to spend that vast oil money on their own people, and empower them to make regime change if they choose to, not us. If there's going to be regime change, President Trump has made it clear, if there's going to be regime change, it's going to be not at the hands of the United States, but at the hands of Iranians who have had enough of their now weakened regime that has been in power for 47 years. That's the reality. And it's not going to be Iranians living outside Iran, and it's not going to be Americans. It's going to be Iranian people who have risen up again and again, only to be stabbed in the streets, imprisoned in vast amounts. You know, let there be no doubt, this is a regime that has captured and killed their own people for 46, 47 years. This is a regime that has led to deaths of Americans and others around the globe. And I happen to be of Lebanese ancestry, and I can tell you, I have been going to that region for 30 plus years. They have created a situation in which one of the most beautiful places on the planet, a place in which Christians, Jews, and Muslims live together, and many other sects since the beginning of time, they do not, because they're captured by Hezbollah, funded by Iran. So when I'm passionate about the need to support Israel, I'm supporting Israel because they're our ally, but I'm also supporting the fact that Iran, since the time I was a second lieutenant, or first lieutenant, I guess, in 1979, they have been the nemesis of president after president, and they have led to a cost to the world, the cost of freedom and progress, not just in Iran. So passionate about it, yes. Happy about what's happened? No, you're never happy that this was necessary. President Trump did everything he could to avoid it. Let's face it, he went through his first 4 years trying to avoid it, and he went into this administration trying to avoid it. But the difference now is Iran has to make a decision. They're no longer in the nuclear business. Are they going to try to go back to the rocket and missile business? Are they going to try to close down the straits? I got to tell you, when they did it in 1987, Reagan responded by sinking their fleet. And I have no doubt that this president who wants peace is not going to tolerate the international order being disrupted by these people.
And Congressman, finally, how much will China and Russia, and whether or not they decide to lend a helping hand to Iran, dictate how things move forward?
China and Russia have been opportunist in this, but I don't think they want to go directly against the United States. It's not in their interest. The fact is, China and Russia, particularly China needs the rest of the Gulf countries to not be their enemy. China needs to not be a nemesis, and China has their own problems. So when it's convenient, have they bought oil at a discount? Absolutely. Would they like to continue? Yes. And by the way, if there's a change in the regime of any sort, I'm sure they'll still be selling to the Chinese. They're good customers. But the weapons that have come out of Iran, much of it with Chinese help, that have been in Russia killing Ukrainians, that's going to stop because of this diminishment, and that's a good thing for the rest of the world.
It's great to have you with us in person this evening, Congressman. Thank you so much. Congressman Darrell Issa, the Republican from California, with his view this evening, live from the nation's capital. Top U.S. officials have maintained the strikes were not meant to force a regime change in Iran, as we've been discussing. That includes Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who said this earlier today.
This mission was not and has not been about regime change. The president authorized a precision operation to neutralize the threats to our national interests posed by the Iranian nuclear program and the collective self-defense of our troops and our ally Israel.
President Trump seeming to contradict that message in a social media post this afternoon, writing, quote, "It's not politically correct to use the term regime change. But if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, in all caps, why wouldn't there be a regime change?" 3 question marks. For more on what's next for the political outlook in Iran, we turn now to Jen Gavito, senior advisor at the Cohen Group, former acting principal deputy assistant secretary of state for Near Eastern affairs under President Biden. It's great to have you back with us here now that we have seen the strikes take place. Your thoughts as we casually discuss regime change and a potential Iranian population that's standing by to rise up. Is this naive?
I think it's tremendously naive. And I should say first, it's great to be back with you. I do think that this is tremendously naive. We have seen nothing to date that suggests that the Iranian public is in a position at the moment to rise up. It's certainly true that this is a brutal regime. Certainly true that it suffers from the lack of credibility among its people. That being said, there don't appear at first glance to be viable alternatives available to foment the type of uprising that would be needed. And I do think it's very important to remember that this is a sophisticated form of government. This is not is not Gaza. This is not Syria. This is layers upon layers of institutions. And so it's not even clear necessarily what regime change would mean. Does that mean deposing the supreme leader?
Well, that's an excellent point. I guess we all have questions about that. I wonder, though, Jen, if you think regime change is naive, is it also naive to think there's a chance of Iran returning to diplomacy, to the negotiating table? What incentive do they have to do so at this point?
Yes, certainly. I hope that they will find their way back to the negotiating table. I am not sure how that happens in the immediate term. I think if you look historically at how Iran has responded to strikes, certainly not by the U.S. in recent memory, but against their interests, and history will tell us that they are going to respond. I think that goes without saying. And so whatever warnings we've heard out of the administration, to the contrary, I think just, again, is not necessarily realistic. I think what will be telling, though, in their response is whether, it looks like they are attempting to de-escalate the situation or whether they continue to escalate. My prediction would be that they will feel like they have to strike back in a serious way. Their nuclear program, their missile program, those are existential for this regime. And so this has been a significant hit against their interests. And I think that you are likely to see a pretty considerable response. And so again, then, what comes next? Does the U.S. administration then seek themselves to de-escalate and try to provide the incentives that you referred to get them back to the negotiating table? Or does the situation, the escalatory cycle, continue in a way that it's difficult for either side to back down? And I think there's real danger there.
Well, so is this a traditional military response, in your view, Jen, attacking our air bases, for instance, in Baghdad or Bahrain? The Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. We've got bases in Syria and Kuwait to worry about. Or is it a cyber attack or, God forbid, a terrorist attack here on American soil?
I think it could plausibly be all of the above. We know that they are active in the United States. We know that they have cyber capabilities, but we also know that more traditional attacks, particularly against U.S. interests, which they have already threatened, are all in their arsenal. And so I think that it could come in any of those manners. The other thing I think that is, again, important to remember is that Iran in the past has really exercised some strategic patience in retaliation. And so while we are almost certainly going to see some sort of response in the days ahead, I'm not sure that we're going to see the total response. And so, you could look, I think, certainly months out and predict that there will continue to be implications, even if, things stop here as far as U.S. strikes go.
Okay. All right, Jen, we appreciate it. Jen Gavito, senior advisor at the Cohen Group and former acting principal deputy assistant secretary of state for Near Eastern Affairs during President Biden. Thank you. Coming up, oil futures up 3% as the market weighs the risks of Iran disrupting energy flows in retaliation for this attack. We'll discuss with Bob McNally of Rapidan Energy Group next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I can report to the world that the strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated.
I know that battle damage is of great interest. Final battle damage will take some time, but initial battle damage assessments indicate that all three sites sustained extremely severe damage and destruction.
That was President Trump last night announcing the U.S. military attack on Iran, and General Dan Kane, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, this morning providing an early assessment of the damage. And back with us now on this special edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, live from the North Lawn of the White House, is Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. So, Tyler, obviously there is still much we don't know about the extent of the damage that the U.S. was able to inflict on Iran's nuclear capabilities. But what else have we learned throughout the course of today?
Yeah, hey, Kailey. Well, a U.S. official tells us that President Trump has spent today working here at the White House, but that doesn't mean that we haven't heard from the president. In fact, he did comment on what he thinks has been the extent of the damage, calling it monumental in one of his flurry of posts on Truth Social. He also confirmed for us that those B-2 pilots are now back at their home base in Missouri. And then in a third post, we talked about this at the top of the program, but it is worth reiterating. He did mention the words regime change in a post, although it is unclear under what sort of circumstances the U.S. would really get behind that idea. So those are sort of the threads that we're watching at this hour. But of course, it comes against this important backdrop of how is Iran going to end up retaliating here. And that is something that the White House has said that they are prepared for and they are watching closely, particularly when it comes to U.S. personnel in the region. Now, we should say that our analysts at Bloomberg Intelligence say that there are sort of three ways that this could go. One would be a calibrated response by Iran that could even look as if Tehran lets the U.S. know what sort of targets they're going after. The second would be a calibrated response, but no sort of ceasefire. We know that President Trump has previously said that he wouldn't be in favor of a ceasefire, but instead just wants to see what he has called unconditional surrender. But then that third option would be that Iran actually hits back hard. And Joe and Kailey, there are three ways that we are closely watching that this could happen. It could be going after energy infrastructure in the region. It could be going after those U.S. assets that we have been discussing. But the third would be closing or any sort of impairment of shipment through the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, that would be a pretty big development here for what it could mean for global oil shipment to those exports and those supplies going forward.
And something John Bolton indicated earlier this hour would not be terribly successful for Iran if it tried to do it. Tyler, we were just showing while you were talking video of Donald Trump late last night with the defense secretary, the secretary of state behind him in the cross hall of the White House making this announcement. We've not heard from or seen him today. Does he have any public events on the schedule this evening or early tomorrow?
No, as of now, we have not seen him publicly. We're going to have to wait to see what sort of agenda items do get on the president's schedule. We're waiting for a confirmation that he is going to end up at the NATO summit later this week. Of course, that would be very significant, as we know that our European allies have been lobbying this White House so that they can play a role in trying to get Iran to the negotiating table here and come forward when it comes to some sort of deal, even though, as you well know, Joe, last week President Trump said that Iran didn't want to talk to Europe, apparently to deepen the divide that we're starting to see come about. Though we should say that earlier today, President Trump did have a phone call with his UK counterpart, Prime Minister Keir Starmer.
Sunday duty at the White House for Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall. We thank you, Tyler, for all of your work today. Joining us now with a look at market reaction to the attack, Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick at World Headquarters in New York. Futures are open, Romaine. If you had asked anybody before this evening how Wall Street would react after the U.S. decided to directly attack Iran, I'm guessing the thought would be more severe than this.
I think that was the thought coming in. But remember, we had a taste of this when Israel first struck Iran back late June 12th here in the United States. And I think the playbook that is going to play out tonight and into Monday could potentially be a repeat of that. A big knee-jerk reaction where risk assets get sold off, haven assets get bought. But then a quick rethink here. And that rethink, Joe, is all around this idea of whether this is a regional conflict that will remain regional or something that could broaden out to hit U.S. assets or even something beyond the Middle East. If that were the case, you would probably see more of a severe reaction. We should point out oil prices did move higher by about 4%. They pared back some of those gains, but are still up almost 3% here. Brent crude, remember, hasn't actually traded above $80 a barrel since early this year in early January. It did do that early in this session, and that is going to be a key number to watch. And of course, what will dictate whether it sticks at 80 or goes beyond that is really going to be determined by what happens in the Strait of Hormuz. But real quickly, I do want to just draw your attention back to equities for a second, Joe, because there is a contrarian bet out there right now. And the contrarian bet is that right now, if you are able to get confirmation from a credible source that the nuclear threat of Iran was indeed obliterated or at least significantly hampered, that would actually remove one of the biggest risks to Middle East stability in years. And that potentially could be a net positive for stocks. And the case in point is I would just point you to the benchmark index in Israel, the Tel Aviv 35.
Yeah,
that closed today on a 6-day run at a record high.
An excellent point, Romaine. And as we consider other asset classes as well, I wonder what we expect to see in U.S. Treasuries, knowing they are seen as a safe haven, but also if there's a concern that potentially higher energy prices could lead to higher inflation risk, that could send bonds in the other direction. So what are we hearing about how all of this factors into fixed income?
Yeah, the Treasury market is really going to be kind of the Jenga game that this market's going to have to wrap its head around, because it's really not just about what's happening in the Middle East. It's obviously what's happening with the fiscal situation here in the U.S. And as you just alluded to, this idea of economic conditions and inflation conditions, whether the Middle East situation feeds into that, we will see. The numbers you're looking at on your screen right now, keep in mind here, this is an incredibly muted market right now. The full session really doesn't open for another hour and a half here in the U.S. Futures, at least as represented by TYA, and if you type TLT, the main ETF that tracks long-dated bonds in your screen, you'll see that the activity is almost minimal at this point, very low volume and very little price change, but that could change, Kailey, in about an hour and a half's time.
What you just said, Romaine, was really fascinating, pointing to stocks in Israel. If we show up tomorrow, we still don't know for sure. Does the market hold its breath until we find out what the actual damage assessment is in Iran?
Well, I spoke to several analysts this afternoon, and two things that they said they're really keeping an eye on. The first is obviously what is Iran's response, if at all, and more importantly, how severe can that response be? But the other thing, too, was to really keep an eye on this idea of trade flows, the ships coming in and out of the Strait of Hormuz, the ships coming around the Red Sea, the ones that are around the Horn of Africa. If you see major disruptions in those areas, that would probably be cause for an alarm. You would first see that play out in the commodity space, and then that would trickle over into FX and then eventually into equities. But short of that, the general consensus seems to be that you might have some softness on Monday here in the cash session, but that could potentially be bought in the same way that we saw stocks get bought after the sell-off on June 13th.
All right, Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick in New York for us tonight. Thank you so much. And as Romaine mentions the Strait of Hormuz, that's something we heard about from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, during an interview on CBS's Face the Nation earlier today. Take a listen.
The first people that should be angry about it are the Chinese government, because they take a lot of their oil comes through there. So they should be the first ones that are saying if they mine the Straits of Hormuz, the Chinese are going to pay a huge price. And every other country in the world is going to pay a huge price. We will too. It'll have some impact on us. It'll have a lot more impact on the rest of the world. A lot more impact on the rest of the world. It would be a suicidal move on their part.
Joining us now for more is Bob McNally, founder and president of Rapidan Energy Group. He was also a White House energy advisor to President George W. Bush. Bob, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. I don't know what you think the probability is of Iran actually doing what they've threatened to many times before and never have done, choking off the strait entirely. But do they have potentially just as disruptive secondary options available to them when we think about all of the energy infrastructure in this region?
It's great. Yeah, no, thank you. It's great to be with you. I think Iran will be very cautious and careful about attempting to fully disrupt the 18 to 20 million barrels a day of oil, 20% of traded LNG that goes through the Strait of Hormuz. They could do it. They have the military means to do it. But I think the secretary is right. They'll be reluctant to do that. It would be suicidal and self-harming. As you noted, they have other options. In September of 2019, they did a demonstration attack on the most important energy infrastructure in the world, the Saudi stabilization plant at Abqaiq. And that Sunday, we had the biggest open ever in Asia. We hardly see that right now. So they could also have proxies harass or attack ships here and there without a full-blown attempt to disrupt all of Hormuz traffic. So they have options to flash, if not play, the oil card.
Really interesting, Bob. You were with us a week ago tomorrow, setting the table for what was about to happen here. You talked about these possibilities, and we've seen oil behave pretty well since then. Is this market whistling past the graveyard, or is it in fact pricing in the risk that we're facing in the next couple of weeks?
Yeah, Joe. No, I think we see an oil market that, as we discussed, is pretty inured to geopolitical disruptions in oil markets. Over the last few years, we've had several false alarms. The Russian invasion of Ukraine being one, and Israel and Iran's exchanges last year being another. Then oil prices spiked, but there was no disruption, and they sold off. So traders are starting to think, there's nothing here. And so I think, look, we're up $10 a barrel since the war started, now a little more. And so I think there's appropriate amount of risk in the market right now. And as you said, traders are sort of holding their breath, waiting to see if Israel, Iran, expand this conflict beyond military and political targets into traded energy. So far, no one's pulled that trigger yet. And if they don't, I can see the price kind of reversing.
Well, so when we consider that, Bob, what kind of spare capacity elsewhere that doesn't have to navigate the Strait of Hormuz or potentially is vulnerable to any kind of Iranian retaliation is there out there for other oil producers who may be able to make up some of the gap at least?
Well, the problem is all of the spare capacity in the world is inside the Strait of Hormuz, mainly in Saudi Arabia, UAE, a little bit Iraq and Kuwait. Now, there are some options to redirect barrels around the Strait of Hormuz, but it's not a lot. There's the East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia, about a 5 million barrel a day capacity. Now they're using a little bit of it now, so maybe they can push 3.5 through that. UAE has a new pipeline, Habshan Fujairah, maybe a million or so through that. So maybe you could, out of the 14 million barrels a day of just crude, not products, but just crude, maybe 3-4 million barrels a day could be redirected around the Strait of Hormuz. But in terms of spare capacity, the bad news is it's all in the war zone.
Bob, you famously helped George Bush refill the SPR. And as we consider the potential need for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve here, if in fact this became a protracted conflict or we saw a massive interruption in production or supplies, what kind of a situation would we be facing with an SPR that's half empty?
Yeah, I hope there's and I expect there's a lot of, reconsideration of the wisdom. And both parties did this initially of selling down the SPR, as you noted, and then President Biden spilled about half of it for no good reason, really, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So here we are at a little over 400 million barrels. So we have half the capability that we would otherwise. And we're the biggest strategic stock holder in the world after Japan and Germany. So look, I think if we saw an interruption, there would be a coordinated stock release between us and our IEA partners, International Energy Agency partners. But we could maybe do 2 million barrels a day. But again, there's the math problem. We have 14 million barrels a day of just crude, another 6 or so of products. And, that's only going to make a dent. So it's unfortunate. And hopefully if there's a silver lining from all this, Joe, from an energy policy perspective, there will be a bipartisan reconsideration of the wisdom of letting down our guard and our defenses.
And finally, Bob, knowing that you know the Gulf states quite well, they obviously have not reacted positively to the U.S.'s decision-making here. What is their greatest concern right now? What role do you expect that they will play in what happens going forward?
Yeah, the Gulf countries are very concerned that the war will expand to include attacks on key Gulf infrastructure, Abqaiq, Khurais, Ruwais, other big terminals, refineries. They're all there in close proximity to Iranian weapons they still have, and they desperately don't want to see this conflict become a general conflict in the region. And so they're very worried, very concerned, laying low. OPEC Plus is not changing policy. From an energy perspective, I think their message is we're going to stay with what we're doing, we're going to lay low and hope this blows over.
An important voice for us this evening, Bob McNally, the founder and president of Rapidan Energy Group. Bob, thank you so much for being with us. President Trump's decision to strike Iran, a major reversal from his campaign promise to be a peacemaker, no new wars. Here's the president during his inaugural address in January.
We will again build the strongest military the world has ever seen. We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars that we end, and perhaps most importantly, the wars we never get into.
Let's assemble this evening's political panel. Ashley Davis is with us, Republican strategist, partner at S3 Group, former special assistant to the Secretary at the Department of Homeland Security. Also, Joel Rubin, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for House Affairs at the State Department under President Obama. We've got a great panel, and welcome to both of you. Thank you for being with us here. Ashley, your thought on what we just mentioned. No new wars was the promise. This is what many Trump supporters pointed to as an example of success from the first administration. Did that change today, or can President Trump keep this isolated to one night of strikes?
Well, first of all, good evening to you. I'm on the West Coast, so it's good afternoon to me. But Joel, it's nice to see you. I haven't seen you for a while, and to be back with you. I think, Joe, the main point here is that he felt that the nuclear threat that Iran had was much more important than the kind of America First agenda. You can see that there are certain members of the MAGA movement, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, that said, we still need to stay out of it, obviously. Other allies like Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon. But I think that he'll be able to explain that with Iran, which is a state that harbors and funds the most terrorist organizations in the entire world, them with a nuclear weapon is more serious than America First policy. But I do think that he thinks this is, as many have said yesterday and today, that this is a war on Iran's nuclear weapons, not on Iran. And if it continues to stay just that, I think it will be okay. But if it widens into a broader war, it's yet to be seen.
Yeah, that's a big if, Joel. Do you think the president has political support behind him now? And will that remain if this actually turns into another prolonged conflict in the Middle East?
Well, quite frankly, and it's great to be with you, Ashley, as well. Look, we have a real problem here politically, which is that both parties have large constituencies that do not want any American involvement in military action abroad. Now, I supported the action last night. I think it was the appropriate one at this moment in time. But there needs to be an explanation about what the goals are, what are the limitations, what's the next step for the day after, how are we protecting our forces, how do we deal with, as you're all discussing here, the Straits of Hormuz, other types of potential attacks against our interests. And so that needs to be fleshed out. It can't just be a strike and then move on to the next news cycle. And so in Congress, we're going to see a debate, most likely in the Senate on the floor because of a privileged resolution on the War Powers Act. The House is thinking about it, but I don't think we'll see Speaker Johnson put something on the floor. But that needs to be ventilated, and that will give confidence to the American people that there is a plan and a rationale. If not, the anti-war wings of both parties will continue to raise their voices.
We're going to add another voice to this conversation. In Holly Dagres, senior fellow at the Washington Institute for the Near East Policy Program on Iran and U.S. policy. It's great to have you back with us as we consider what's going on inside Iran, the question about the day after. What is Tehran prepared to do? How long will it take?
Thank you for having me on the program. I think we're all waiting for bated breath, whether inside Iran or outside of Iran, to see how they're going to retaliate against these U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. It's really hard to say right now. I think when we war gamed this over the years, there were numerous things that they were looking at. There was this, the most obvious would be to strike U.S. forces, U.S. bases across the region, to close the Strait of Hormuz, to take dual and foreign citizens hostage, to practice transnational repression, and of course to activate its proxies, which have now very much been maimed in the post-October 7th climate. So this is what we're waiting to see happens. But of course, these calculations can change because this is very new territory for the Islamic Republic, but they're also in a fight for their survival.
Well, and Ashley, as Holly mentions things like hostage taking, when we consider the threat of potentially sleeper cells being activated and terrorism, whether at home here or abroad, if you were still inside the Department of Homeland Security, what would be underway as we speak to try to hedge against that risk?
Yeah, I'm assuming, and for those that remember, I would assume that we are at high alert at the red level back in the days of the color-coded system because of the sleeper cells that are definitely and has been known for many years in our country. I mean, just from the last 4 years alone, and this is not a political statement, just a fact, is that 1,200 Iranians have come into the country that we know of. And so where are those people? Are we able to keep control of it's not just Iran that we have to be watching for, but the other sponsored networks by Iran and the terrorist cells that they have. And so that is the thing that is scary to me the most in regards to our homeland. And there is definitely a high alert in regards to the department right now, and obviously the local law enforcement around the country.
You want answers. How long does the Trump administration have before it needs to answer the questions you're asking, or just give a baseline estimate of how much damage was done here?
I think the baseline of the bomb damage assessment needs to be relatively soon. I would assume that we are currently investigating using drone technology and other assets on the ground, and that the Israelis.
Can we tell what happened underneath the mountain, though? I mean, do you have to send people down there to find out?
Well, they can tell about radiation, and so the IAEA has said that no radiation has spilled. That's a good thing, and so they're going to be looking at that. My goodness, if it takes too long, it's going to create more turmoil. But regarding timing, much of it, as Holly points out, depends upon the Iranian reaction. If Iran does not physically react in the near term, I think that we'll see a lot of people moving on. But I just can't see that happening where they are completely passive at this moment. There's too much need, as Holly again points out. They are in a fight for their survival. They also internally have to take care of ensuring that this is not a window of opportunity for the opposition to lean in and say that now the regime is destabilized and we can make a move. So there are a lot of factors here that are out of our American control as well that will be driving this timetable.
Well, and when we consider the future of the regime, obviously multiple administration officials have said a regime change is not the objective here. And yet, Holly, earlier this evening, President Trump takes to Truth Social to say the following, quote, "It's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be a regime change?" Holly, do you have an answer to his question? Why wouldn't there be?
I mean, from what we're understanding from President Trump's public statements is that he still is open to negotiating, to stopping this war from going on. But at this juncture, it's hard to imagine the Iranians sitting at a table when they were supposed to sit across Steve Witkoff just 3 days before the strikes began. And then, of course, everything's history now. So I think that just to tell them, hey, we've struck your nuclear program and now we expect you to sit down with us, I think that's really hard to believe that the Iranians would be open to right now. What they think they would very much be pushing for is some sort of ceasefire. But on the topic of regime change, I just want to note, we're not just hearing this from U.S. President Donald Trump. We're also hearing this from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He put out a public statement calling on the Iranian people to rise up and change their regime. We also heard that from former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. The name of the operation is Rising Lion. Rising Lion, of course, is a biblical reference officially, but it also is a dog whistle. It's a dog whistle to a life in Iran pre-1979. And the tweets that the IDF has been putting out in Persian includes actual images of a lion and a sun. And that is a very much symbolic of Iranian nationalism. So this whole idea that maybe Trump is just saying something, I think that there's something hidden between this messaging right now. We just don't know because they haven't targeted political leadership thus far.
Ashley Davis, I want to tap your experience as an expert in Homeland security as we consider the possibility of an asymmetric attack, questions about the day after. How prepared is the U.S. for a terror attack here at home?
The scariest thing about a terror attack here in the United States is not knowing how they're going to attack you. So are we ready for someone taking over a plane again? Yes. Are we ready for suitcase bombs in the middle of New York? Yes. Are we ready for someone going into a Starbucks in Iowa and blowing themselves up? How do you ever predict that? So I think that there are big things that we have and are better than we were pre-9/11, but there's still a long way to go. We still do not have the capability of interoperability between our law enforcement on a state and local level and our federal forces. We're getting better, but it's 24, 25 years later, and we're still not up to capacity. And as I said at the beginning here, and this is just the unknown, the scariest part of a terrorist attack is the unknown of what they are going to attack. And also, let's go back to COVID. If we have some sort of biological agent that is dispersed throughout our country, are we ready look at how we dealt with COVID throughout the country and the world. Are we ready to deal with a biological weapon? Not too sure about that.
All right, Ashley Davis, we appreciate it, as well as Joel Rubin and Holly Dagres, all of you. We appreciate your time and insights today on this special edition of Balance of Power. And on a programming note, this conversation will continue tomorrow on Bloomberg Surveillance, where at 8:15 a.m. Eastern Time, they'll have a live interview with Danny Danone, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations.
We'll get back here as well, of course, on Balance of Power, the early edition, and we'll be back here at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. In the meantime, check out the Washington Edition newsletter on the terminal and online. We thank you for joining us. The special edition of Balance of Power. Alongside Kailey, Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and Radio.